So in this video, we are going to talk about Reconstruction and sharecropping. We're really not going to get too much into the Reconstruction plans or anything like that, or all the different issues at this time. Just want to give a quick kind of review, just to remind you kind of what Reconstruction was, a little bit of the problems there. Talk about sharecropping, and then maybe just kind of finish up with just a little bit of other things about how life was during that time of Reconstruction, and then immediately afterwards. And sharecropping is actually a pretty important part of that. And so that's kind of going to be our focus. All right, so Reconstruction has to answer some questions. What is the status of former slaves? Are they free? Are they? So yes, that's been answered with the 13th Amendment. But then what political rights, what human rights will they be afforded? How will the freedmen fit into the American system just of government and life, society? How's that going to work out? What is the relationship of former Confederate states and the federal union? So these states that left the union, what's going to happen to them? Are they going to be completely accepted and everything like that back in? Will they have full rights and things of that nature is also a question. Will former Confederates be allowed to vote? Will the states have representation in Congress? That kind of thing. These are the kind of questions that Reconstruction had to answer. So during this time, we did see the rise of what are called black codes. Southerners tried to keep freedmen unfree. So black codes would restrict black occupations, restrict their ownership of property, access to the judicial system. They would impose forced labor for people that were said to be vagrants or who loitered or lacked employment. And so this was just a way to keep control over these former slaves. And then violence was used. In 1866, an angry whites burned homes and churches and schoolhouses in a black section of Memphis. And so we see these kinds of things happening at this time. The Freedmen's Bureau is a response to the fact this great need that happens as a result of all the formerly enslaved people that are free. So it's an agency that was created to help former slaves. They gave food and clothing, tried to find jobs, set up schools. Grandparents sat next to grandchildren in many cases in these schools because there was this just great desire. There was a recognition that education was their kind of opportunity to improve their lives. And so grandparents that had never been allowed to learn to read and write are right next to grandchildren that are finally getting that opportunity. So formerly enslaved people, so what did they do? So there's this whole economy in the South that is based on slave labor. What is going to happen now? What kind of jobs are going to be available? People have to provide something for themselves and their families, and how's that going to work? All this work that was formerly done by slaves on plantations, if a farm is going to be successful, still needs to be done. And so are these former slave owners going to now be able to hire slaves to do the formerly enslaved people, the freedmen? Are they going to be able to hire them? Are they going to, what's going to happen? What's that going to look like? Well, freedmen did not really want to do anything that looked like slavery again. So if they didn't really want to be hired for a wage to go work on that same plantation or a different plantation than the one they had just escaped from, basically, as a result of the Civil War. So what happens is a sharecropping scenario where a parcel of land you're given, not given as in ownership, but you're given kind of responsibility for this parcel of land, and you grow, in many cases cotton, but it could be other crops as well. You grow that crop and you share a portion of that crop with the owner of the land, and then they get a portion of it because they own the land. You get a portion of it because you work the land. Is kind of the idea, and that's how it would work. Now, the portions that would be divvied up depended it was somewhat dependent upon the deal that you could make with the owner of the land, but also then you also needed tools and things of that nature. And so we'll look at that a little bit. So sharecroppers often became dependent on merchants and planters who gave them credit at high interest rates. So if you needed tools, you needed the seed, you needed all these things to plant to make this um, your particular plot work, well, then you could borrow that off of your future earnings, which meant that the owner would get even more of the crop. And so you often may not be able to survive off of everything. And so you might have to borrow more money. And so many cases, sharecroppers ended up kind of tied to the land because they owed so much money. And so they couldn't really get out of that. Even with that, though, contact between those who owned the land and those who worked it declined. So maybe at first, after the very end of the war, there was more contact, but over time, it kind of people realized, wait a second, um, I'm working this land. I want to make as much as I can with this, so I'm going to work as hard as I can for this land to get a good crop because I get part of it. And the owners of the land recognized, well, that they don't have to go watch and tell them what to do, and that's really what happened. So if you were working on the land and you were sick one day and you were like, I can't work today, and you chose not to work, well, you nobody came and told you you had to get to work. Um, if 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 your child needed help in the middle of the afternoon with something, there was some problem and you had to go help them, nobody told you you couldn't go do that. Now, of course, if work needed to be done to get the crop and make it successful, you knew that as the person that was working that land. And so you probably didn't make those decisions lightly to choose not to work. If you were just a little bit sick, you'd probably work right through it. But the point here is that the contact between these former plantation owners that now are the owners of the sharecropping land, there's less and less contact. And so there is more freedom for the sharecropper than there had been during slavery. Now, if we compare it to the way things should be, if we compare it to the way things are now, the sharecropping situation was awful. If you compare it to the way it was during slavery and during Civil War and before, well, it was an improvement. And so we have to recognize the sharecropping situation was certainly not fair, but it was an improvement over what had been. Um, an example, in 1870, only 2% of freedmen owned any land. By 1890, 20 years later, 21% of former slaves owned land. And then by 1910, about 24% owned land. So we see that there's a pretty good improvement in 1890, and by 1910, there's not nearly as much improvement that happened in that time period. So there were limits, but we do see some improvement happening here. So initially, right after the Civil War, during this sharecropping time, families are trying to reunite with those that they were separated from. Freedmen Association, Education with Freedom, and sought it out vigorously. So freedmen associated education with freedom and sought it out vigorously. They began forming their own churches, separate from their former masters. And this is also when we see the rise of the KKK, which is terrorism. They dressed in white robes and hooded Klansmen rode at night to the homes of African American voters, shouting threats and burning wooden crosses. Klan members murdered hundreds of African Americans and their white allies during this time. While still underrepresented, blacks made significant gains during Reconstruction. 2 U.S. senators from Mississippi, 16 representatives, 600 African Americans served in state legislatures, And the Alabama Colored Convention of 1867 declared it is our undeniable right to hold office, sit on juries, to ride on all public conveyances, to sit at public tables, and in public places of amusement. And so there was some improvement, political improvement, even while um, and because of that political improvement, that's part of why we see the rise of the KKK and other organizations at that time that were fighting against equality. But we still see some improvement happening. Here's a famous picture of the first colored senators. Is the title? It says the first colored senators and representatives in the 41st and 42nd Congress of the United States. Of course, today we don't use that language. We would say African American, but that was the language of the time. And that was the language that was used in a way to be actually more respectful as opposed to other language that was that was clearly racist and harsh. So here's more pictures. So the question ultimately is, did Reconstruction go far enough? Well, the answer is no, but improvements were significant. The alternative to segregation at that time that blacks faced throughout the South was not integration, but complete exclusion. Segregated schools, for example, replaced not integrated schools, but no schools at all. So while some laws were changed, hearts often were not during this time, and so we see a big problem. We see lots to overcome still, but there were some improvements. Now, once Reconstruction is over, some of those improvements disappear, but there was some improvement.